Since 2007, TF2 has become the ultimate sandbox, a place where modders throw whatever crazy idea at the wall to see what's stuck. This is where we got Mario Kart, CP Orange, but more importantly, Deathrun, a source engine staple that's somehow detached from its Counter-Strike origins to thrive in a team shooter. Think about it, the last thing you'd expect to do when booting up TF2 is dodging knives or giant lasers. So why did Deathrun land itself in TF2? To find out, we have to go back to the beginning. Deathrun as we know it dates all the way back to the Counter-Strike source era. Unlike modes such as Versax and Hail or Slender Fortress, their game mode concept never really had a main developer or plugin maintainer. The gameplay experience itself was entirely mapper driven. Many of those early maps were made over 17 years ago, with much of their history buried in old forum posts from the early Wild West internet era. But the core principles of Deathrun haven't changed. One player activates traps, everyone else tries to survive and reach the end. Simple enough, right? But remove any direct combat between the teams, and suddenly, the entire mode becomes a test of timing, prediction, and strategy. Something which can't be said for a lot of other game modes that existed around this time. Early Counter-Strike Deathrun maps were extremely primitive, and maps were shaped around everyone being given only melee, with weapons sometimes given only during minigames or specific map events, where you go up against the Activator or Terrorist. During this era, there was very little form of counterplay against traps, and CS mappers had the expectation people could b-hop, or at the very least strafe, to avoid traps, which weren't even marked in early maps, mind you. Deathrun in this era was pure trial and error. Nobody even really knew how to play it or bait traps properly, but the shortcomings of the maps and game mode were negated by the novelty and how unserious everything was at this time. This was the type of game mode you'd play casually with your friends on a private server, with everyone having no idea what was happening but enjoying themselves nonetheless as they played. The entire mode was nothing but a fun experience as people laughed over VC as they learnt where the traps were and made mistakes. Most of the time, half the server was yelling over each other as they fell into traps, and usually, the Activator would win given how low the player counts were. But it didn't matter, the game mode wasn't competitive. It was an experience where people had the time of their lives playing something from the server browser they normally never would've. Deathrun was a breath of fresh air at this time, amongst the midst of team PvP oriented game modes, which is why it was able to jump across source titles, from CS to Half-Life 2 Deathmatch, before it eventually landed in TF2. By this point, Half-Life 2 Deathmatch's version of Deathrun felt like a more polished evolution of the mode from Counter-Strike. Deathrun maps were actually starting to become more detailed, and move beyond being basic, long, concrete boxes, with traps sprinkled along the way. Mappers were now starting to introduce things like environment hazards in their maps, and HL2 Deathrun made b-hopping way easier, giving runners a form of counterplay against traps in the form of speeding through before the Combine even had time to activate them. This is where Deathrun started to develop as a polished experience. The reason Deathrun was so easily ported between source titles was because of how simple of a concept it was, and also, all these games used a source engine, allowing for the fundamentals of Deathrun to slide through into any game without too many changes to the gameplay's core. At this point before 2012, the game mode didn't even have its own plugin. Instead, it mooched off one particular source mod that was popular in its own regard, Versax and Hail, particularly relying on its functionality of keeping only one person on blue team to allow for Deathrun to work. This is proven by how early maps like VSHDR Forest had to include double prefixes in its name for the Sax and Hail plugin to actually work. At this point, Deathrun was in a very experimental state, you could say. Servers were rare, but the ones that did exist often cobbled together plugins on top of VSH as an attempt to form a cohesive experience. Early TF2 Deathrun servers were unstable at best, and you'd be lucky to find a server which didn't feel haphazardly put together or run maps which weren't buggy. Players constantly cheesed traps using TF2's movement quirks, and slowly, people began learning how to bait and anticipate traps, instead of running straight into them, like people in Counter-Strike. But at the end of the day, the whole game mode just gave off a very amateur vibe with how everything felt. Deathrun was still working out its kinks, especially with class balancing, which was the biggest hurdle the game mode had to jump over when transitioning into TF2. Unlike other versions of Deathrun, TF2 classes weren't blank slates, with the same speed, same knife, and movesets. TF2 threw a wrench in the plans of server owners trying to port Deathrun by making every class have their own unique movement, abilities, and more importantly, weapons. So many weapons could either break or completely avoid traps, which is why some servers opted to just take the guns away and force people into melee, like other iterations of Deathrun. Eventually, on November 11th, 2012, the first standalone Deathrun plugin was posted on Allied Modders, giving birth to an influx of brand new Deathrun servers, and more importantly, maps. The lifeblood of the plugin. TF2's Deathrun community finally had a dedicated plugin built specifically for them and to accommodate for TF2's needs, which allowed for more experimentation with all the nuances TF2 had to bring. This is also the period where Deathrun began to flourish in both its community and mapping scene. Compared to Counter-Strike's Deathrun, TF2's version was much different. Aside from the obvious bouncing changes for every class, like the removal of buildings for Engineer, banning Scout's double jump, and stripping away Medic's Ubercharge, there was also more minor things, like the omission of B-hopping, which was a staple for old CS Deathrun. But the TF2 Deathrun community would explode in 2012, with much more maps being created and hosted on servers, causing Deathrun to get far more recognition and garner a following for itself on YouTube. This early foundation set the stage for Deathrun's golden age. This was the era when many of its iconic maps were made, but more importantly, this was the beginning of its rise on YouTube. But although Deathrun was flourishing at the time, how was it going to evolve, and more importantly, survive through the early 2010s into the modern TF2 era? It's hard to describe how big 2012 was for Team Fortress 2. Most people boil it down to being the year MVM came out, or the year SFM released. But reducing it to just one of those moments does the year a huge injustice. What I and many others see 2012 as is the year the TF2 community exploded, not only on YouTube, but across every corner of the game, including Deathrun, which happened to get swept up in the cultural boom TF2 was experiencing at the time. Deathrun in 2012 moved away from being that quirky, buggy game mode you'd accidentally join while looking for VSH, and instead evolved into a mainstay in the server browser. Deathrun at this point was not only improving in its gameplay, but also in its maps. Maps were, and still are, the lifeblood of Deathrun. But now, with a growing community and an actual plugin behind it, mappers were now starting to take Deathrun more seriously. And this is one of the first major cultural shifts which happened in the Deathrun community. Remember how I said Deathrun began to flourish in its mapping scene? You can see this most obviously in how maps really started honing in on their theming and atmosphere. 2012 was the year when mappers collectively agreed that making concrete box dev texture maps weren't gonna fly anymore. What people wanted now were maps that had theming and a sense of identity. I mean, if all Deathrun maps stayed as the poorly designed, long hallway, old internet reference dump maps they were before 2012, Deathrun would have never made it past 2015. And the reason this shift happened comes down to two very important mappers, whose work managed to pull Deathrun out of the hole it was digging itself into. To understand why the shift even occurred, you have to go way back and look at how Deathrun maps were like before 2012. Most of them were disjointed, meme-filled maps, where if you were lucky enough, you might have gotten something vaguely resembling a theme, like Open Barren Void for example, a far cry from what even a complete beginner mapper can pump out today. These maps were good for the novelty and fun they brought when Deathrun was still establishing itself, but they were never a permanent solution. They were certainly not built with the intention of replayability, and after 2012, creating maps which met the bare minimum requirements wasn't enough anymore. Players wanted maps that entertained, immersed, and felt cohesive. This demand for an actually good Deathrun map was soon fulfilled by people like Audio Trash. Custom maps made before 2012 followed a consistent trend of shoehorning references to old internet or referencing other media, and this was seen in how Audio Trash's first Deathrun maps took pieces and parts from other franchises to create an enjoyable experience. Although TF2 did have its own theme mappers could fall back on, even back in 2012, mappers were starting to get tired of the whole Badlands desert theme and wanted to try something new. Deathrun maps prior to 2012 very rarely had a theme or even had much detail, and would often use the same Half-Life 2 textures across the entire map, or stick to dev textures. Why dev textures, you may ask? 1. It was very easy to just not bother with changing the textures you already used during the prototyping phase. And 2. It kept the map visually distinct and separate from vanilla TF2 game mode maps. Players back then just didn't have as high of expectations for mappers as they do now, meaning mappers didn't have to do nearly as much to entertain the masses with the lack of competition they had back then. Players could tolerate a map here or there that was visually simple and had dev textures, but having every map like that would have meant Deathrun would have stagnated quickly and lost its player base. On the topic of low-effort map design, janky traps and buggy game logic was a staple in maps back then, as people were either figuring out how to use the hammer editor for the first time, or came from other games which had completely different game logic. This is evident in how all the maps, particularly DR Forest, the first Deathrun map ever created for TF2, would have easily exploitable spawn doors, broken hitboxes, and very simplistic traps. I'm talking about Half-Life 2 models popping out and killing the player level of simple. Players, of course, at the time, just had to tolerate and accept this level of jank from earlier maps because there were no other options, but also more importantly, because many servers would have their own custom plugins in place to compensate for the lackluster quality of maps back then. But some mappers had enough of poorly designed maps with no clear direction and sloppy game design, which is why people like Audio Trash and Dr. Face came in to kickstart the first major Deathrun mapping renaissance, simply through publishing their own maps, which would gain popularity in the community. Initially, Audio Trash started out as a mapper from Game Banana, who came from a long background of making maps for other source games, like Left 4 Dead. And that experience showed in his Deathrun work when he made maps for TF2 as early as 2012. At the time, when people were stuck using the same old buggy hammer editor, and community tools were far and few between. But more interestingly, although Audio Trash publicly released only 2 maps, DR Horrors and DR Sawmill, he had several ambitious Deathrun projects that never saw release, including a sequel to an old map, an entirely new media reference map, and an exclusive map commissioned for Skyle by Bottiger around 2013. One of these unfinished maps would eventually make its way into a jailbreak map out of all places, which is just a testament to how respected Audio Trash was in the Deathrun community and how versatile his ideas were. The map in question that ended up getting recycled for jailbreak was titled DR Horrors 2, and very little was known about the map, apart from it being worked on when Audio Trash came back to the community sometime around 2020. Parts of the map were shared around with close friends for others to repurpose, but it would be prominently used in JB Carnival, a Halloween-themed jailbreak map which used lots of buildings and landscapes from the map. Another lost Audio Trash map was DR Manor, a map which was commissioned for by Bottiger of Skyle and still wasn't finished. But nonetheless, the map still released by a poster on Game Banana, who managed to get DR Manor from Bottiger himself to finish and post. The last important forgotten Audio Trash media reference map I mentioned before was DR Mario World, another map protected yet again for the server it was made for. Protection involves stripping the entities from a map and injecting them back in server side, but this has prevented some maps from ever being played again. Luckily, both DR Manor and DR Mario World were recovered. Back in the early 2010s, Dr. Face was already well on his way to learning source mapping through Hammer, building sets for his popular Gmod TF2 videos. This alone placed him miles ahead of many other mappers from before 2012 who were inexperienced in Hammer, and it showed in their work. After spending time around other mappers who were also experimenting with Deathrun, he eventually decided to dive in headfirst as a side project between his Gmod work. Dr. Face liked Deathrun's focus on linear, progressive obstacles, and he enjoyed creating traps, because most of the time, they let him mess around with entities in the Hammer editor. Many of Dr. Face's maps were inspired by old PS1 platformers, borrowing ideas or soundtracks, which is something he did in Safety First, but more prominently, in PlayStation. What he loved about designing Deathrun maps was how unrestricted the rules were compared to traditional TF2 maps. You didn't have to worry about sniper sightlines or choke points, which removed a major creativity bottleneck and made Deathrun mapping far more enjoyable. His first Deathrun map used a construction theme, since he was studying construction at the time in college, and after discovering a TF2 map's construction asset pack in 2011, he went on to create DR Safety First, arguably one of the best maps to come out of 2012, and one which still holds up in servers till this day. When Safety first released, it was loved and frequently hosted on servers Dr. Face played on. The sense of validation and belonging he received in the community for his work proved to not only himself, but to everyone else that he was a capable mapper who could deliver polished, memorable experiences. From there, he would only get more ambitious, eventually going on to create his final Deathrun map, DR PlayStation, in 2018, a map which quite literally pushed the limits of Hammer Editor and TF2 at the time with its complexity and boss fights, which we'll come back to later. Dr. Face was an innovator during the Deathrun Renaissance, not because he made the prettiest maps, but because he made memorable experiences. He pushed ideas and features into the scene, encouraging more mappers to experiment with unique traps, NPCs, and vehicles. Even after he left the Deathrun scene to pursue other opportunities, Deathrun never truly left him. Much of his Deathrun design philosophy persisted in his Globtastic series for Left 4 Dead, which borrowed many Deathrun-esque elements. Meanwhile, in 2012, Deathrun was exploding in popularity. Videos were hitting hundreds of thousands of views, boosting play counts, and sprouting dozens of new servers. At this point, you'd have to have been living under a rock to not have heard of Deathrun, but we wouldn't be here today if Deathrun was just another game mode that popped off on YouTube in 2012. Something or someone had to carry it past the early 2010s, and after contacting everyone I could who knew about Deathrun's history, I can finally present the true reason why the game mode didn't die, and the people responsible for giving it a second life. Deathrun as a game mode has always been a collaborative effort, and unlike traditional plugin driven modes like VSH or Slender Fortress, Deathrun wasn't being pushed forward by a plugin maintainer releasing updates. Instead, it relied on innovators within the mapping scene to push the standards of what was expected in the community, in turn causing real quality improvements across Deathrun from someone simply deciding to try something new. This became especially important during the transition from the early 2010s into the modern era. The groundwork laid by the original pioneers had carried Deathrun through its golden age, but by the mid-2010s, many early contributors had already moved on. The question now became, how do you improve a game mode that has already evolved so dramatically? The answer came down to doubling down on what people loved about the maps, like the minigames, trap design, and theming. As the old pioneers of Deathrun left, new ones came right in to fill the void. And this time around, players and servers were starving for innovation, someone to truly reinvent the wheel yet again, and push Deathrun into a new era with maps. This time around, it would come down to one notable mapper, which, if you've been playing Deathrun at all recently, you're guaranteed to have run into one of his maps. I'm of course talking about no other than Bun Bun. On April 4th, 2017, Bun Bun created his first Deathrun map, DR TF2 Museum. It wasn't perfect, and was riddled with bugs and problems, but that didn't matter, as players could see the overarching design philosophy and unique mapping style shine through, which would become commonplace in the future thanks to him. Museum showed the community the early signs of what would be Bun Bun's signature mapping style, with strong theming, multi-ending maps, and a fast release cycle. The map was received decently well, but more importantly, it put Bun Bun on the map, and he would go on to drastically up his mapping game in the months to come. He would release maps like Trump Tower, Lazy Town, Neo Noir, and Valve HQ, which would go on to become mainstays in the server map rotations, and officially cemented him as a highly regarded figure in the community. As CreamTea, another Deathrun contributor, which we'll get back to later, put it,
he really is probably the most important map creator in the history of TF2 Deathrun, because he truly revolutionized Deathrun.
And he's right. After comparing maps released before 2017 to after, the Bun Bun effect is pretty obvious. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, as each map Bun Bun made stuck so strongly to their theme and had so much effort put into them. It served as a wake-up call to everyone else in the community to up the ante and try harder with their maps, especially as Bun Bun had a strong work ethic throughout his time in Deathrun, working quickly to make new maps and never cutting corners when detailing. But the bugs and exploits in his maps, on the other hand, that's a whole different story. But just making high quality themed maps isn't the main reason why I'm talking about Bun Bun. Sure, he did set the bar high in terms of theming and had some unique trap designs, but so were so many others. The real reason he changed Deathrun so much came down to respawning and minigames. Bun was infamous for always including at least 1 or 2 minigames in his maps at the end, serving as a reward to the runners for reaching the end, and also to add some variety to each round. This new formula of minigames was unheard of, as nearly all maps had 1 or 2 minigames, which would get repetitive quickly from their simplicity. Bun really emphasized including high quality minigames in all his maps. Another thing we have to talk about is respawning. Deathrun, and even arena mode in general, have a glaring flaw baked in of spectating. No one wants to sit and spectator watching people have fun over actually playing the game, and this problem is exacerbated even further on longer Deathrun maps, which was most of Bun's at the time, with the minigames included. To fix this issue, Bun introduced something that would completely change how people play Deathrun, adding a full team respawn in his maps if one runner reached the end. He wasn't the first to try this idea, but he was the one who made it mainstream. The mechanic first gained real attention in DR PlayStation, where Dr. Face handled it in a way that felt fair and earned with the respawn cartridge. After PlayStation popularized this concept, Bun incorporated it more blatantly in his maps, serving to help cement respawning as a standard feature across almost every modern Deathrun map. But the implementation of this in maps, just like minigames, sent shockwaves across the community. And as CreamTea puts it,
yeah, anyone who wasn't playing before then doesn't realize how much he changed things.
Overall, Bun was a heavy hitter in Deathrun's transition to the modern era, and served to implement all the luxuries people nowadays take for granted. Who knows what Deathrun would be like right now if Bun never started mapping, and the legacy he left behind will never be forgotten. Following Bun, another mapper came in to build heavily on the theming aspect he introduced in his maps. Remember what I said about the bar of Deathrun map quality being much higher compared to before? Whereas Bun modernized Deathrun, SpookyToad created maps which barely even felt like TF2 in a good way, by expanding upon the multi-layered game logic from maps like PlayStation, and created even more complex experiences. SpookyToad first entered the Deathrun scene in late 2017, with a map titled Deathrun School. As he said himself, it wasn't good, exactly what you'd expect from a first map, and it was later reworked heavily by other mappers, but that's besides the point. Even then, similar to Bun, you could see the early makings of a legendary mapper. As he would create more maps, you could really see what would become his signature style, a focus on immersion, depth, and making maps which felt like they had an actual identity beyond being just corridors with traps.
By depth, I imagine it to be a subcategory 1, which is actual lore of the map. What map tries to give you its lore like a game. It tells you a story about it.
This is what separated SpookyToad from many other mappers during this era, and what made him special is how he, similar to other prolific mappers like Dr. Face and Audio Trash, focused on the atmosphere part of each map over the typical approach of traps or parkour, even more so than people from before him. What made SpookyToad's maps instantly recognizable was their focus on environmental storytelling, soundscapes, and more importantly, lighting. He wanted to create artworks in his scenes, and as SpookyToad puts it for Deathrun mapping,
a lot of people miss lighting tutorials, lighting setup. They just slap light and light and light, and it doesn't look good sometimes. But a good lighting can make a very big change.
After SpookyToad released Berlin, he would continue refining his atmospheric approach, which became even more apparent in his next project, Bog. And after Bog's release, he immediately began working on a massive update that would completely change Berlin, pushing the map even further past people's expectations. On May 8, 2019, SpookyToad released Berlin Redux, his most ambitious project. In terms of technical complexity, it rivaled PlayStation. Berlin pushed the limits of what was believed possible in Deathrun, and tried out many new concepts, which were not tried before. The map began feeling like an entirely different game at parts, from its cutscenes, boss fights, and minigames. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, just know nearly all of what SpookyToad accomplished in the Berlin map would take so long, most mappers wouldn't even bother. The boss fight in particular just showed his work ethic when it came to making maps and his hammer editor know-how.
The biggest problem of creating that minigame was having a separate legs and separate top part. And before Blitzscript, I had to go with very cursed workarounds to make those two work together.
This kind of innovation defined the modern era of Deathrun. And keep in mind, A lot of Berlin's features were made before VScript. Nowadays, maps are even crazier and more complex. SpookyToad was creating cinematic set pieces with custom logic and scripting in Berlin, and this is what separated him from nearly all other mappers. But he also represented what the modern era of Deathrun was all about, creating cinematic experiences that were atmospheric and fun. Even till this day, SpookyToad was still innovating in his general map creation, which is best seen in his newest VScript map, Boss Chase. SpookyToad also understood the cultural shift occurring in Deathrun, highlighted in Bun's maps, after people got a taste of what it was like to respawn in Deathrun, and people often complained when a newer map in 2019 didn't have respawning.
Even some people complain if you don't bring up respawn mechanic. They simply complain that I don't want to sit here and wait until guys are finished. No, I want to play a game, blah blah blah.
This perfectly encapsulates the shift from old school Deathrun maps, which just prioritize funny meme references and traps, to modern Deathrun, where minigames and theming was king. SpookyToad helped define this modern era shift to Deathrun. His maps represent the artistic peak of the modern game mode, atmospheric, ambitious, and technically complex, built with a level of effort that most mappers never reach. Bun was the first to open the door to higher quality maps, with an emphasis on theming and minigames. But SpookyToad went all in on fully technically complex maps, shaping the identity of the modern Deathrun game mode. But there's still one person who I've mentioned before and still haven't talked about yet. Someone who would contribute and help with modern Deathrun in a different way, not through creating maps, but by maintaining older ones and helping the next generation of Deathrun mappers. I'm talking about CreamTea. He joined way earlier than the people I just mentioned. And funny enough, it was on complete accident. How can you join a Deathrun server on accident, you may ask? Remember what I said earlier about all the Deathrun maps having double prefixes due to needing Versax and Hale's plugin functionality to work? That's what confused CreamTea to join a server which he thought was VSH, only to end up in Deathrun instead. But like many other people who were introduced to Deathrun, accidentally or not, he stuck around long enough to see the game mode evolve, and eventually go on to contribute himself. Unlike people like Bun or SpookyToad, he wasn't focused on reinventing the wheel or pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible. Instead, he played a quieter but equally as important role in the Deathrun ecosystem. He kept all the maps in the rotation by fixing bugs and adapting new maps specifically for Skyle's player base. He also tried his hand at making maps, albeit not as spectacular as other maps, but still decent in their own regard. But more importantly, he created tutorials to help newer aspiring mappers learn the basics of Hammer. All of this in a period where the game mode could have easily stagnated. And as he puts it,
once people stop making maps for a game mode, the game mode tends to die out because not everyone can map.
This is the uncomfortable truth people in Deathrun have to accept. And instead of just waiting around for someone else to step in, CreamTea stood up and started fixing up all the maps, became active in the community, and made tutorials when most people wouldn't even bother. As he explains,
I want to make it as easy as possible for new people to get involved, even if you never used Hammer before. I think if you followed my walkthrough series, you would understand how to make one.
CreamTea, also being someone who came from the early ages of Deathrun, understood what made Deathrun fun. And while other mappers chased gimmicks or tried to outdo each other with spectacle, he gravitated towards something much simpler, ensuring the map was actually fun to play. He experienced the era where Deathrun wasn't all about minigames and cinematic boss fights, but about baiting traps and enjoying yourself in a server with the same familiar faces each night. That early culture shaped his entire philosophy. For him, a map didn't need to have all the bells and whistles to be good. It just needed to be fun. If a map wasn't enjoyable for both the runners and activator, it simply wasn't made with the player's interest in mind, and people would naturally not vote for it. He mentioned how some maps which leaned too heavily into parkour elements put people off, and others forced sacrifices with traps that were impossible to survive. Both of these elements didn't appeal to him. Instead, he believed Deathrun worked best when it stayed fair, balanced, and fun over everything else. Additionally, CreamTea had a very grounded understanding for how players behaved, and that went on to shape how he approached the mapping. He'd seen firsthand how quickly new maps died if they were too difficult or experimental, and he'd seen how players gravitated towards familiar, recognizable maps, even if they were basic or outdated. simply because they were comfortable and proven to be fun.
But I think, like, if that's what the players want, then who are you to stop them, you know? Like, if players want to keep playing Lazy Town again and again, like, you can't really force them to enjoy something else.
All of this is what makes CreamTea an underappreciated but nonetheless important figure in the modern era of Deathrun. He wasn't out there making flashy maps or pushing the Deathrun scene forward, but he was the one quietly working behind the scenes, fixing up old maps, making hit maps on his own, and looking out for the future of Deathrun in his tutorials. But during this transitional period for Deathrun in 2019, there was one server which was the center of attention and held the most loyal community of veterans, including even Bun, who was an active member of the server, even going as far as exclusively releasing an early version of Neo-Noir before he did anywhere else. I'm of course talking about retro servers, which became the definitive Deathrun experience for many players. As SemiColon/Backslash, a frequent player of modern Deathrun, described it, retro servers had a surprisingly chill vibe, where text chat was more active than voice chat, and people would do things together, like group rancho relaxos, until the motivator came too close. This atmosphere made retro servers feel different compared to other servers, from how you'd recognize the same names every night, and a sense of familiarity made it a place you'd have to have been there to experience yourself. This is also where another mapper from this era, named Coronarena, enters the picture, after first being introduced to Deathrun from the Scrap.tf community. Retro servers was the place in which he spent the most time with skilled and supportive players. When he released his first new maps, like DR Sprint, which was heavily inspired by another map, DR R60D, retro servers was the first to host them, and instead of players trashing the map, they actually encouraged him to keep going.
They were the most skilled at the time, they were the most accepting as well. The new map came out, they would give it a try.
Retro servers was an environment with many talented mappers, like Bun, SpookyToad, and Zakira-san, another mapper who made a Necrodancer Deathrun map, who all helped to shape the work of not only Coronarena, but many other mappers. It was the place to be for anyone, whether you were just playing normally or wanted to map, and became the go-to place for feedback. It also played a massive role in the 2019 Deathrun boom, when Neo-Noir exclusively released on retro servers before it had on Game Banana or the Steam Workshop. It created a huge surge of interest during the summer break, which hadn't been seen in years. Players flocked to retro servers out of curiosity to try it.
So when players saw this map and tried it and realized, wow, that is a phenomenal map, they'd keep coming back to retro servers. That was a big boom.
But the hype wouldn't last for long, and as summer ended and players returned back to work or school, the server player counts nosedived, and the server lost its momentum.
Just after the end of summer holidays, I think, for Americans, the British, whatever, they didn't have much time for Deathrun and they went back to school.
But it still left a lasting impression on the Deathrun community, still holding its prestigious role as being the place to go play all the best new maps, and play in a supportive and friendly community. Till this day, the void left by retro servers still hasn't been filled by other popular servers like Panda or Skyle, and it represented the last major era of the 2018 transitional period of Deathrun, during the peak of Bun's maps and innovation. At some point after 2021, a shift occurred in the timeline for Deathrun, as nearly all of the servers running the game mode shut down or lost their playbase, and we were left with nothing but Skyle. But Skyle wasn't always a top Deathrun server. It actually began as a small personal server hosted by Bottiger all the way back in 2009. During this period, it wasn't even called Skyle until 2010. By 2011, Skyle eventually added Deathrun to its roster, right in time before Deathrun's 2012 renaissance. But more importantly, TF2’s cultural boom. It became the place where many great maps from the time were played and promoted, while other servers fell into the common pitfall of adding every map from Game Banana into the rotation, regardless of quality. Skyle carefully curated theirs, avoiding maps which were too punishing or parkour heavy, which would have turned away new players for the plugin. Over the years, Skyle grew to become best known as a community with the philosophy of including not only the best Deathrun maps, but retaining as much of what people love about TF2. Whereas many other servers stripped weapons away and forced each class to run at the same speed, Skyle didn't. Instead, Bottiger retained TF2's identity instead of watering it down, keeping every class feeling unique and letting players keep their shiny weapons. before many other servers at the time. Skyle was one of the first major Deathrun servers to treat Deathrun as a serious, evolving game mode, and not as a novelty, by adding many quality of life features most people take for granted, such as reporting rule breakers or stopping ban and mute dodges. Every server was tightly monitored for crashes and buggy maps, which although meant many older maps such as DR Assassinate or Forest wouldn't be hosted due to their buggy nature, on the positive side, it meant players were only experiencing the best Deathrun had to offer, keeping new players hooked and more likely to come back. The effort Skyle invests into their servers is mostly the reason why Skyle's Deathrun servers have attracted such a loyal following, with the players partly responsible for keeping the servers afloat. But you might be wondering what it's like playing on it, and based on my experience, it's one of the best ways to experience Deathrun if you're a complete beginner. You keep mostly all your TF2 weapons, every class doesn't feel the same, and who even cares about B-hopping when 90% of players don't even know how to strafe? After all, providing a good introductory experience for newbies is vital for Deathrun right now, as the game mode as a whole needs new players badly. Ever since 2017, according to Bottiger, community servers have been suffering for a long time after being tucked away in the bottom of the main menu. Even recently, after Valve began cracking down on cheat bots in official servers, the servers in which players would refuge against bots have become ghost towns, and Skyle servers have reached a point where the amount of new players coming in is lower than the amount of players that naturally stop playing. That's the reality servers like Skyle face today, stuck running a well-maintained replayable game mode, holding out for new players who may never arrive. This raises the important question of what the fate of TF2 Deathrun will be if things keep going the way they are. Deathrun as a whole is a game built on the concept of failure, either the failure of the death to time a trap, or a run of falling into one. When a map is well designed, without too many unavoidable RNG obstacles, you don't stop and rage quit because you died early on. People don't quit because you have to watch the match. They stay because watching a goofy trap destroy other players is funny. Combine that with short round times, a motivator, alongside the prospect of respawning at the end, and that's more than enough to keep players hooked. Unlike other arena-style plugins, Deathrun makes you embrace the fact that you probably weren't gonna reach the end anyway, serving as a reminder that in gaming, failure is just part of the process. Sometimes, we naturally get tunnel vision on the prospect of winning, and ignore an equally important aspect of gaming, the value of the experience earned from losing. You probably remember your first time playing TF2 as a free-to-play, getting constantly domed by better players, and wondering why you kept losing the objective. But TF2's whole learning process wasn't all about winning. It was the slow, rewarding process of getting better through trial and error. When you first start playing Deathrun, you're almost forced back into an environment where trying hard doesn't matter. You find fun through the little moments in the experience itself, and ultimately, at its core, that's what gaming is all about. But as TF2 slowly fades into obscurity, suffocated by all the contemporary Fortnite Nicki Minaj ASAP Rocky collabs and new friend-swap titles, the art of long-form TF2 documentaries slowly die with it. But not all hope is lost, because there is still one thing you can do: subscribe. I know a couple subscribers aren't gonna bring TF2 Deathrun back from the dead, but you'd be surprised by how many more people get to hear the story of niche TF2 communities, all through a simple action. And maybe, just maybe, we'll see TF2's Deathrun persevere longer. If you made it this far, you clearly enjoy source mod history discussion. So if you want to hear about another popular game mode which has seen more success in recent years, you can click the video on screen to learn about the rich history for Versax and Hail. And as always, have a good one.